Here's a quick review of the different types of notes and how many beats they each get in 4/4 time. If we imagine that this blue card is one measure or one box of music, then this note is a whole note and it gets 4 beats because it takes up the whole measure, all 4 beats. So for this note, you would count 1, 2, 3, 4. The next kind of note that we can talk about is a half note. Each half note takes up half the measure, which is why it's called a half note. So if each measure gets 4 beats, then half of that would be 2. So each half note gets 2 beats. 2 plus 2 is 4. The next type of note that we have is called a quarter note. And it's called a quarter note because each one takes up a quarter of a measure. So if the entire measure is 4 beats, each one of these gets 1 beat. So when we add them all together, they add up to 4. The next kind of note that we have is an eighth note. And you'll notice each eighth note has a flag. So I can fit 2 eighth notes inside a quarter note. That means if the quarter note gets 1 beat, each eighth note gets half of that 1 beat. Eighth notes get their name because you can fit 8 of them inside a measure. And each of these gets half of a beat. The last kind of note that we'll talk about is called a 16th note. And you can guess 16th notes get their name because you can fit 16 of them inside a measure. And if you notice, these 16th notes all have 2 flags. So this is where it gets a little trickier. So I can put 2 16th notes inside an 8th note. That means each 16th note gets 1/4 of a beat. So as a review, a whole note takes up the whole measure and gets 4 beats. A half note takes up half the measure and gets 2 beats. A quarter note takes up a quarter of a measure and gets 1 beat. An eighth note takes up an eighth of the measure and gets half of a beat. And a 16th note, you can put 16 in a measure and it gets 1/4 of a beat. Now when we sight read, we're going to double the value of each of these notes just to give ourselves more time to think. So a whole note that gets 4 beats is actually going to get 8 sight reading pulses because we're doubling the 4. A half note that gets 2 beats, when we double it, we'll give it 4 sight reading pulses. A quarter note, which normally gets 1 beat, will give 2 sight reading pulses. The eighth note, which normally would get half of a beat, now gets 1 sight reading pulse. And a 16th note, which normally gets a quarter of a beat, now gets half of a sight reading pulse. So let's apply this to an actual sight reading. So for this first example, example 26, the first kind of note that we have is a dotted quarter note. A dotted quarter note actually gets 1.5 beats. So I'm going to go ahead and mark in a little tick mark and then half of a tick mark. So 1.5. We already said an eighth note would get half of a beat. So I'll do half of a little tick mark here. We said a quarter note normally gets 1 beat. So I'll give it 1 tick mark. And then we've got another quarter note, so another beat. Then here we have another dotted quarter, so 1.5 beats. An eighth note, so half a beat. And here's a half note, which normally gets 2 beats. All right, I'm going to keep going the same way. 1 beat for my quarter. Okay, so there's what each note would normally get with beats. But for sight reading, we know we want to double everything so that we can give ourselves more time to think. So I'm going to double everything that I have here. Instead of giving this first dotted quarter 1.5 beats, it's going to end up getting another 1.5, so 3 total. My 8th note, instead of getting half a beat, is going to get a full sight reading pulse. My quarter note will end up getting 2 sight reading pulses. Same for the next one. Here's another dotted quarter, so I'm going to double what it already has, and it gets 3 sight reading pulses. My 8th note will end up getting 1 sight reading pulse, and my half note, if I double these 2 beats, it's going to get 4 sight reading pulses. Okay, and there you can see each note and how many beats it would have gotten, but total, since we double, how many sight reading pulses. Hopefully that helps a little bit with sight reading and beats and the difference between beats and sight reading pulses.